Welcome back to Africa This Week. If you have been following the news lately, then you would agree that recent years have seen a growing trend with extreme weather conditions fueled by climate change, creating record-breaking environmental after effects in Africa and around the world. From rapid urbanization to dense pollution, everyday events continue to show how irresponsible humanity has become in preserving the elements of nature, making it slow to hit the warning of global warming. Joining me on Africa This Week to dig deep via Skype is Nnimmo Bassey, the Executive Director Health of Mother Earth Foundation, presently at the Climate Conference in Poland. Thank you for joining me. Now, what's your take on the growing concerns of climate change and the efforts to deal with this environmental issue?
Well, this is the reason why the world agreed to have these climate conferences that has been going on year after year. The challenge we have is that the weather conditions are getting more severe, but you don't see that sense of urgency in these official multilateral global negotiations. Many of the delegates and nations here are busy politicking over the details of the agreements, especially the Paris Agreement that was agreed in 2015. I think nature is showing us more and more that the urgency is so much and that we are actually at the brink of a climate chaos or catastrophe. So one would expect to see a lot more ambition and more willingness by especially the rich nations to take actions, but we are not seeing that happening. The direction that things are moving is based on, of course, the well-acclaimed agreement called the Paris Agreement of 2015, as I mentioned earlier. But that agreement doesn't really have the instruments to hold nations accountable. And this particular Conference of Parties is expected to draw up the rule books by which the Paris Agreement will be implemented. And the African delegates here are concerned that whatever is agreed at the end of next week must be a rule book, not just a rule book for the sake of it, but one that has clear milestones that are measurable and things that will happen that are real to take real action on climate change.
If you are proposing a new agreement, saying that the Paris Agreement 2015 does not hold nations accountable, do you think world leaders are looking in that direction?
Absolutely not. They are not looking in that direction, and this is the dilemma of some of us who are analysts and looking at the situation, because maybe we'll go back again to see the fundamentals of the Paris Agreement. The major things nations are expected to do is termed the nationally determined contributions. A nation that Nigeria said Nigeria is going to cut emissions by 20% unconditionally, but by 45% with additional funding from international partners. And many other countries have submitted the measures of the nationally determined contributions. So the aggregate of what nations propose to do to cut emissions is supposed to lead the world towards having a temperature increase of not more than 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. Already the temperature increase above pre-industrial levels is up to 1 degree, something that people thought would not happen in any recent time, but that has happened already. Now, the national determined contribution, what countries have said they're going to do to cut emissions, when scientists of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change add them up, they are telling us that unless real action is taken within 12 years, we're on track to have temperatures that will be up to 2.7 or up to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and that would be totally catastrophic.
That's really scary. We must cut emissions within 12 years. But I think the major problem is that many don't believe in this environmental threat. Take, for instance, the United States President Donald Trump. He once called it a hoax. Now, what will it take to fully enlighten the minds of such persons that global warming will affect this planet we call home?
Unfortunately, many countries and leaders are moving more and more away from the reality of the challenges of global warming. But Brazil just elected a president who has said they're not going to host. They were supposed to host the climate conference next year in Brazil, but he is moving the same direction as the American president, not believing that global warming is really happening. But it's just a kind of delusion when leaders don't believe the evidence of things happening around them. Everybody sees there are more freak storms, more typhoons, more cyclones, worse droughts and floods, even in Nigeria and everywhere around the world. And no nation is really prepared to contain the kind of climate disasters that we're seeing around the world today. So what will happen is that because citizens of the world, many citizens are the ones suffering the impacts, not the top shot politicians. And so what citizens of the world can do in each nation is to use their ballot paper. Luckily, these guys are not staying in power forever. Use the ballot to ensure that people who have environmental concerns are put in place of authority. Because come to think of it, if the earth is burnt, there will be no state house, no White House. There will be nowhere for anybody to exercise power.
Nowhere will be safe. Well, you are currently in Poland now. What do you make of the climate talks over there, and what are some of the key issues being raised?
As I said earlier, the major focus of this conference is to produce a kind of guideline or rule book for how to implement the Paris Agreement. And have spoken very closely with some delegates from Africa to understand what the challenges are and to gauge their feelings about what is going on. And they are concerned about the direction of the conversations, of the negotiations. And they don't want negotiations to come out in a way that polluting nations and entities will get off the hook and place more burden for climate action on poor and vulnerable nations. One of the challenges, one of the issues that progress not being made at all in the first week is climate finance. And those who are expected to provide the bulk of the money are trying to present that climate finance can come by way of grants, by way of loans, and not additional funding as expected. If they come by way of loans and grants, poor nations who go that way are going to become more indebted and by that means become more vulnerable to the impacts of global warming. So that is one problem. Yes, and the issue of mitigation and adaptation to global warming impacts, and the very vital issue of loss and damage, which came in the Paris Agreement, not much progress being made in this direction. And these are the areas that are of critical concern to poor, vulnerable nations in Africa, in the Pacific, and in other regions that are very exposed to the impacts of global warming.
All right. Tell us, what enduring outcomes are we expecting at the end of these talks?
At the end of 2 weeks, you are going to make me an optimist or a prophet, and I'm trying to. I'm hoping that with focus by delegates from countries and regions who are really exposed to the impacts of global warming, will ensure that outcomes don't deviate from what was agreed in Paris in 2015. What was agreed in Paris to some of us wasn't the best, but weakening that would be worse for the world.
What must be done now to ensure that talks on climate change count this time, especially for Africa, and not just mere rhetorics?
I believe that our delegates, official delegates, and politicians who are coming to Poland by next week must ensure that they don't play politics with the process, and that they listen to the delegates who have been following the technical negotiations, and that they don't make backroom deals, and that actually they push, like President Buhari, when he spoke on Monday, insisted that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities must be applied in every dimension of the negotiation. Now, that is a core principle. If our leaders can insist on that, this is one of the basic principles of the Climate Convention, that nations have different responsibilities for the problem, historically and currently, The rich nations have been polluting since the Industrial Revolution, and the poor countries have hardly emitted anything. And so the convention recognizes that whereas everyone has to take action, but the responsibilities are different and the capacities are different. So our leaders have to insist that this core principle is adhered to. If that principle is not adhered to, then the principle of justice in terms of climate change will be gone. And if that is lost, it will be a sad day for poor countries.
Nnimmo Bassey, Executive Director, Health of Mother Earth Foundation, thank you for joining me on Africa This Week.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Africa finds itself worst affected by the effects of global warming as resources become degraded and biodiversity is being disrupted to the point where the future of life as we know it on Earth really looks bleak. The way forward is to go green by choosing reduce, reuse and recycle until humanity and nature find the system to adapt and the solutions to adapt for all to thrive and leave footprints of sustainable development for generations to come. That's it on Africa This Week. I have been your guide, Fadeshala Shotingwa. Many thanks for watching and bye for now.